So I'm going to jump right in. We come finally to panel 4, Next Steps, a Vision for the Future of Human Rights Philanthropy. Let me start this panel by introducing myself and saying a few words about the discussion that's been taking place from my own perspective. I started my career at Amnesty International in 1985, where I did everything from outreach to legal and health professionals to research at the International Secretariat to helping organize a global rock concert tour to commemorate the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. As a result of my experience in chairing a task force on Amnesty International and women's rights in the late 1980s, I ended up co-founding an international women's rights group, Equality Now, in 1992, with the intention of using the human rights framework to address women's rights more effectively. Although it has survived and thrived, this group never really made it into the international human rights movement, in my view. Hillary Clinton and many others have said that women's rights are human rights, but the women's rights movement is not and has never really been part of the human rights movement, in my experience. In 2011, I started a spin-off of Equality Now called Donor Direct Action, which raises funds online and from private foundations for frontline women's groups around the world. And here in the US, I co-founded the ERA Coalition in 2013, which I work on with Mona Sinha to help revitalize efforts to get the ERA in our Constitution, which to the surprise of many around the world does not have a provision on sex equality. My training is in law, and I've also worked in international criminal justice on a number of Rwanda tribunal judgments, including Akayesu, the media case. In 2012, I led the drafting team for the judgment of Charles Taylor in the Special Court for Sierra Leone. And I did several stints in the United Nations in the Office of Legal Affairs and the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. For the past 4 years, I've been here at Roosevelt House, where we've been engaged in various convenings and incubations. In 2018, we held the first strategic planning session for what became the Global Survivors Fund, co-founded by Nobel Peace Prize laureates Denis Mukwege and Nadia Murad. Last year, after the fall of the Taliban in September, we convened an online meeting of Afghan women leaders with global women leaders, which led to the formation of the Women's Forum on Afghanistan, an Afghan women-led initiative to bring their voices into the global dialogue on the future of their country. I tell you all this to say that I have been in the trenches of the human rights movement, and I consider myself something of a loyal dissident. As I mentioned yesterday morning, my experience has all been on the other side of philanthropy, seeking funds for the global women's movement, mostly without much success. What I find often in the women's movement is that the most capable women leaders closest to the ground are the least likely and least able to get significant funding to support their work. They know how to make change, but they don't know how to raise money. The goal of Donor Direct Action was to make it easier for them to get funds, unrestricted general operating support, without creating too much of an intermediary layer, just enough to protect donors from the risks referred to yesterday that prevent them from making grants directly. Donors choose where they want their money to go, and at least 90% is re-granted. I think there are real obstacles that have prevented many large foundations and government funding agencies from doing the grassroots funding they say they want to do, and it has become a vicious circle. The Canadian government in 2017 launched a 5-year, $150 million initiative to support local women's organizations in developing countries working to promote women's rights and gender equality. From what I have read, the 4 largest grants, totaling almost a third of this, went to ActionAid, the Carter Center, Oxfam, and the Asia Foundation. Now, these are all great organizations, but they are not local, and they are not even women's organizations. No doubt, at least some of the funds reached the grassroots organizations for whom they were intended. But for me, the question is how much? And even more importantly, what is the nature of the dynamic that is then perpetuated in our movement between international and national NGOs? And I think that was referred to in the last panel. I think we have to look closely and practically at these patterns if we want to translate the desire for change into a meaningful shift of resources as well as power. I think Duncan mentioned some key points on this, in particular the trust issue, and Regan spoke about the power of philanthropists. This final panel is a big picture look at the issues that have emerged over the past day and a half, a review of the existential questions facing the human rights movement. This room is very committed to the success of the human rights movement, and yet also very aware of the challenges we face. These challenges have threatened the expansion of, and perhaps even contributed to the contraction of, philanthropy which fuels our movement. So we will look more directly, I hope, at the question of relevance and ways in which we might be able to collectively address these challenges. Our distinguished panelists, who I want to invite up to the stage, are Hash Ibrahim and Grain de Burka with us in the room, and Chidi Odinkalu and Atala Kutab online. I see both of you. Yes, welcome. I'm going to ask each question initially to two of our panelists, and the first time around, I'll ask them at the outset also to introduce themselves. So let's get started. Okay, so these questions may not sound new, but I think we really want to hit them hard in our last panel and try to get some sense, if we can, of a common understanding, or at least some ideas for next steps. So let's talk about the emerging issues, which we just talked about, climate change, as well as some of the other issues, such as economic and social rights, that have longer been a challenge to the human rights framework, and the movement that has grown up within it to date, not having addressed those issues, particularly guided to a great extent by the philanthropic vision that has fueled that movement. Are these issues that can and should be incorporated effectively into an expanded human rights framework, or has the human rights framework run its course? And just to tie it a bit to the last panel, when we talked about, are these groups that we're talking about as doing human rights not identifying as human rights groups for an important reason that we need to think about? Or do we want them to identify as human rights groups? I think that's part of the question. So let me turn to Hash and then Grania. And if you can just start by introducing yourself and then give us your thoughts on these questions. Thanks.
Okay, thank you so much. Hi, so I'm Hash Ibrahim. I think I'm a bit of a cuckoo in the room. I'm sort of sitting on lots of different sort of spaces, I think. I sit on trusts. I'm a trustee on human rights organizations that are quite traditional. But I'm also, I sit on our foundation, the Mo Ibrahim Foundation, which is very specifically based on thinking that the foundation is looking at governance, and that we think that actually there can be no development or human rights without good governance. And so what we're trying to do in our foundation is say, look, what are the basket of goods that civilians need? And how do we specifically focus on getting good governance in? We work in Africa. In Africa, this is a continent that is, it has the population of India, and yet it is the size of China, India, most of Western Europe, and North America. Right? It has a huge amounts of land, huge amounts of resources. So why is its citizens poor? And it's a question of governance. And how do we change that governance? So it's a very much looking on that sort of field of it. And then I sort of also sit on like Sigrid Rousing, I always sit on the Sesame Street board, which is sort of an organization that works in the US, but then has a model that funds all of its work outside with the money that it makes here, sort of like corporate philanthropy. So I'm sort of trying to look at everything and seeing what works, because I think it's about trying to find the change for the next century, right? Well, this is the century of change. How are we going to do it? And what are people doing and where? Talking about those huge questions, thank you, Jessica. I think the first thing that I mean, if this is a kind of blue sky thinking going forward, I think the first thing is we have to really think about what do we mean by philanthropy. I really looked at, it was so interesting being here yesterday, and I think I have to address a bit of that, of how, what started the philanthropy, and it was certain individuals who had a real idea and a mission to it. Then, but I think now, if you look at the work that is happening now, I think it's not so much the idea. We have to, it's more useful to go away from the idea of who are the people who are giving and who are taking, and much more this idea of sharing, right? And we talked about power before, and this idea of that actually, even money is just an energy, as someone once told me, right? So that you're giving and you're getting something back in return. And that is this circular idea. And I think that is much more useful when we talk about what we're doing and how we work with people, that I think would be really useful. And then I think also going into that maybe a little bit more is just this, when we look at where we're working, what we're doing as well, I think it's really useful to think of following the energy. Where is the energy in our movement? And I think it is in the grassroots. It's in the activists. I was here yesterday, and there was some great energy that came from the philanthropists and the organizations particularly, and the strength of this movement has been in that work and in building and legitimizing the human rights doctrine, I think was so important. But as we go forward in this new century, I think it has to be, how do we tessellate that onto what is actually out there in the world? How do we get that justice for people out there? And it must be advised and led by those people out there in the streets and those grassroots organizations and those activists, because they know how it works. I was really, an example of that, for example, is in Sudan, where we've just seen this, this revolution that has happened over 4 years ago, and people have stood out in the streets, and they're determined to get change in their country. And there's been a lot of work that we're doing, and other people are doing, to try and work out, the legitimacy of that change, and how do you do that and support either, very ossified political parties and a military that won't leave. And you're seeing these incredible young people who have never had democracy or in their lifetime, they're in their 20s and 30s, but they're working out how to make it happen, right? And I mean, I was struck in the last month. They've been out on demonstrations, and the army has gone out, usually on a Friday, and the army has gone out and closed your roads and bridges and stopped them whenever they've come out on a Friday. So using social media, these young activists have called on a Monday for a strike. And by Wednesday or Thursday, the army goes out, it closes all the streets, it uses a huge amount of energy and resources, and then on Friday, 4 o'clock, they just put out a tweet saying, we're not doing it. And they've kept doing it, and it has used up a huge amount of the army's energy and time and resources. And it's this nimbleness and this idea that they know how to do it best because they're on the ground. And I think that we have to kind of, this is all kind of thinking forward of that, I think a lot of the civil movements that we've seen in the past sort of 10 years, from movements in this country, from Me Too movement to Black Lives Matter to even, in the Arab Spring or in Hong Kong or other places, we haven't been ready or haven't seen it because we've been really good at instigating stuff, or we haven't been very good at, in solidarity, standing just right behind and watching and following and supporting what is going on. And I think that is a key as we go forward, as maybe a different way that could be really useful in going forward and supporting.
Can I just ask you a little? This power on the streets around the world that you're talking about, how do you see us as a human rights movement connecting exactly to that power?
Well, that's what I'm saying. I think a lot of the things that I'm seeing is that you see I think it's about this idea of how do you stand in solidarity, right? How can you say we are here to support, like as Duncan said before, how do you say, because they need resources, they need technical experience, they need a lot of understanding of how to connect to wider systems. But they also have an incredible amount of understanding of how they can garner support from the rest of their movement. They can garner support from the people around them that is so instrumental and is so useful. I was also, thinking back, I remember after in this country, after you had a Marriage Equality Act a few years ago, I was in New York, right here, and it was there was like World Pride, and I'd gone out to see it, and there was news reports. There was something like 4 million people in the street, and it was this whole big celebration. And I was with a friend of mine who'd worked very hard for 20 years to make that change and working through that. And we heard on the news report, they said, yeah, there's 4 million gay people out in the street, and it's incredible today. And he turned to me and said, that's not true. There's maybe about 500,000 gay people on that street tonight. But what the rest of it is all the straight people who stand in solidarity. It's all the brothers, the sisters, the co-workers who all changed their minds and who all, because of the way they voted, changed the world for those people. And that's what we need to do for the rest of the world in human rights and everything else, I think. Sorry.
Great, thank you. So my name is Gráinne de Búrca, and I'm neither a human rights practitioner nor a funder. I'm an academic, so But I've been following the debates about the human rights movement and human rights more generally for a long time, and I recently wrote a book on thinking about some of these issues, the current challenges facing human rights, possible ways forward, and what I've called reframing human rights, to try to think differently about what constitutes the human rights movement and what's important within it and how it works, what makes it effective when it is effective. And the book was written in part in response to really increasingly loud criticisms from all quarters, from the left significantly, and not just from the right, of the human rights movement. And something I'll come back to later, maybe not in this round of questions, is actually the right is co-opting, as some of you have mentioned, the language of rights. And in doing so, really, somebody mentioned the Pompeo Commission. Versions of that are happening all over the world, and there are some really powerful coalitions of the right taking the human rights system. I'm working on another project on this at the moment, which we call illiberal human rights. It's a nice oxymoron, but it reflects what's actually happening. So I just put that to the side for the moment, but say that I think, Jessica asked about, well, what are the, in her question, what are the kind of current challenges, new issues, climate change, economic inequality, and so on. Climate change presented as an emerging issue, though of course it's fully emerged and has been emerging for a long time, and the alarm bell has been sounded for a long time. And inequality and economic and social rights as an issue that the human rights movement traditionally and funders traditionally have not wanted to engage with. I wasn't able to be here yesterday, so I missed some of that debate. But I just want to say, going back to something one of the speakers this morning mentioned about discomfort with structural change. These issues are about structural change, climate change and rising inequality. They're massive challenges. They affect everything. They can't be cabined and separated from all of the other issues. So to the extent that we say these aren't human rights issues, or well, that's not what human rights is about, they fundamentally affect the whole array of human rights, economic and social, civil and political. Climate change is going to put massive stress on democracy worldwide, movements of people, the same sort of thing we saw with the pandemic, that governments respond to these massive challenges with authoritarian powers, emergency powers, crackdowns, and so on. So if you care about civil and political rights, you need to care about climate change. It's going to be a huge and really is already an incredibly important force that's overwhelming, actually, many aspects of human rights. Similarly with inequality, and maybe in a slightly different way, maybe the human rights movement hasn't traditionally thought it was wise to engage with economic and social rights, but one of the consequences of the rising inequality and socioeconomic dissatisfaction and marginalization has been the rise of populism and populist authoritarianism. Here in the US, or in many different parts of the world, in the UK, I think you mentioned this morning, the populist government in the UK sounds very illiberal at times, pulling out of human rights systems, EU and the ECHR and so on, but also in the ways it's addressing issues at home. And this move is partly as a result of not having addressed rising inequality. It's not the only cause of populist authoritarianism around the world, but it's one of them, and it's a significant one. So to my mind, not to address climate change, not to address inequality and socioeconomic rights is missing, a huge part of the problem when it comes to the actual enjoyment of human rights. And maybe the other thing I'll just say, because you asked, Jessica, and in the exchange there with Hush, you talked about, is it the human rights framework that's relevant? We can say these issues are massively affect human rights, but are they human rights issues? Should we think about them in human rights terms? And I want to come back to something Martine said as well, when you said, well, rights are, part of the issue, but there's maybe where change is happening is technology. It might be China. My concern with the kind of, I won't say either orness of it, but saying putting human rights there and other things here is that, China and technology as they stand, are kind of neutral, right? So technology, we've heard, I think it was Doug's question, was looking at the dystopian dimensions, the illiberal, the surveillance dimensions of digitalization. There's also the massive potential of digitalization to help human rights activists and so on, just as you were mentioning, Ash. The young are great with social media and with all kinds of aspects of the digital world. China, too, has been a force for lifting people out of poverty massively, also repressing the Uyghur and shutting down, torturing and disappearing dissenters and so on. So to me, you can't say, well, we could fund this and fund that, but maybe human rights sometimes. What human rights is and offers, in the way I understand it, and I know that it's very contested what that is, but the core of human rights is a commitment to things that are universal, that every human is entitled to equal dignity, to welfare, and to freedom. To me, those are the three: freedom, welfare, and dignity, with the equal human entitlement to dignity running through them all. And that amounts to a framework for social justice that I don't think any other framework I have seen, and I've thought about this a lot as I've engaged with the critics of human rights, offers. Critics come up, the left progressive critics come up with answers that just don't offer a normative framework that will stand up. So whether you're dealing with China, economic governance, good governance, anything, without being guided by some fundamental commitments that orient you to whether what's happening is what you want to support or not, I think it's really, it just doesn't offer what the human rights framework offers, stripped down to its core. Many of the human rights institutions and other things have been dysfunctional, have failed, have been inadequate, but the core commitments, starting with the UDHR and expanding into lots of other normative instruments, have been really powerful and still offer, I think, the kind of power that Regan mentioned. The activists, without naming it, identify with: freedom, welfare, voice, dignity, equality. That's what that's what drives them. That's what makes them raise their voices in claiming justice in the contexts that they're in. So my answer would be yes to the human rights framework, but maybe we need to think about it differently, not be wedded to some of the older systems and structures and so on. And I'll come back later too. I'd really love to address some of the other issues, like avoiding the either-orness of governance versus grassroots, that these are totally interdependent. There's no point in instituting institutions of good governance if they're going to be taken over by authoritarians. The institutions are there, right, but they work in an authoritarian way. So they only work to the extent that you have also a civil society committed to freedom, equality, and justice too.
That's great. Just to drill down a little bit on this framing question, when you take an issue like climate change, which, as you said, is not emerging, it's more than emerged, and it's killing us, and I guess the question is, maybe everybody, including the human rights movement, should be putting resources into it because it's a global survival question. But if we're talking to climate change activists, is there an argument to be made, which I think you're making, but maybe you could just spell it out a little more, to say this human rights language and the Universal Declaration is actually helpful to you in your case? Or is it just, basic survival, which is kind of where they're coming from, that they don't really, is there an added value to the human rights angle that could be discussed with that movement? And is that a valuable exchange to have with them? Or is it just simply that as an issue, because it is a question of survival, that we should all be thinking about, if that makes sense?
I would say a bit of both. I mean, some of it, so some environmental activists, maybe, Extinction Rebellion, others don't want to associate with the human rights movement and see it as a very old-fashioned or, static kind of establishment framework. Others, if you think of Greta Thunberg and many of the environmental activists, are using all the kind of institutional opportunities and pathways they can, and many, there are many things that the human rights system offers. Some of them work, some of them don't. So some of the court cases haven't had much of an impact. Others have had great success. Some of the human rights treaty bodies have been, timid. Others have been much more powerful. So there's that's another thing the human rights system offers, if you were talking with the activists, is an array of different forums forums for drawing attention to what you're doing. Some of the ways of drawing attention might be, you know, gluing yourself to the train and so on, but other ways of doing it might be going to some of these forums and getting sort of a political message, a very loud one out. So that would be one thing. But I also think, again, coming back, it's true that survival is primal and is the first instinct, but where people don't see it, that's why people feel, oh, we're not there yet, because for a lot of the world, it's not yet a survival issue. It will be for our children, for our grandchildren, or it will be in these island states. But so maybe the survival argument isn't enough for those who don't feel it particularly, you know, so that, you know, the idea that we're entitled, you know, our lives, the right to life, the right to, you know, to an environment, the right to housing, the right, all the things that are being swept away, that does provide a language and a normative framework, and then these institutional opportunities that help orient not all of your movement or your action, but parts of it.
Thanks. Chidi, I think, is online. Is that right? Hi. Okay. So, Chidi, let me invite you to, first off, introduce yourself. If you would like to comment on any of that, feel free to do that. And then I wanted to ask you to just talk a little bit about the human rights movement. As it's grown, I think we've said over the last few days, it's also decentralized to some extent. And to some extent, human rights philanthropy is supporting this decentralization. But if you could talk a little bit more, which we've talked about in the other panels, about the balance between the global and local, which Grania also just referred to, and some of the related kind of north-south issues, maybe reflect a little bit on the extent to which this balance is relevant to the evolution of the human rights movement and its value, the value of the human rights movement for those who have doubts about its continued value. Chidi.
That doesn't sound very easy. Thank you, Jessica, and good day, colleagues. Can I apologize that I'm a little disembodied from everyone there physically, but that also means that I don't have to be intelligent or intelligible, which is a good allocatus to begin with. It's my way of saying really that you know, having listened to Hirsch and Grania, I'm delighted to be here, even if I count it as a privilege, because unlike them, I mean, you know, Grania says she's neither into human rights nor into grant making, but she's an academic. I'm into none of those. I just do a bunch of things spectacularly badly. I trained originally as a lawyer, spent a lifetime on learning everything that lawyers are supposed to do. And so found myself a little bit of a peripatetic, never do well in civil liberties, in human rights. Ended up with the Open Society Justice Initiative, which is really that part of the Open Society Foundations that doesn't do philanthropy. Basically, it's a it's a subtenant of the Open Society Foundations, and I am now the grandson of teachers trying to learn teaching. So that basically is in an earlier life. Of course, I led Nigeria's National Human Rights Commission and spent a few months in both detention and exile. So that probably shapes my perspective on this. And Jessica, in response to your question, I want to step back a bit, because you talk about new issues, and my question is, new to whom? Which really is a fundamental issue in my view. I mean, maybe those of you in the north find climate change a new issue. In my village, climate change was never a new issue to us. And in many African societies, and many societies in the South, the notion of intergenerational values held in trust for the dead from the dead by the living for the yet unborn is a fundamental obligation, which is underpinned by methods of organization and by norms. And I fear that the first thing we've got to address and I've got to apologize because I did not, apart from the panel before this, I wasn't privy to the previous conversations. And so, like the person who comes late to a funeral, I may well be exhuming the dead body from the wrong part of the anatomy. But if I may say so, the first thing we've got to acknowledge is that in this conversation, there is an underlying power dynamic in our language and in our attitudes that will probably need to be addressed for the future of human rights. There is something I feel, listening to some of this, I feel like some of it is like the language of Livingston discovered Victoria Falls, and Columbus, of course, discovered these United States. But the human rights movement is, I fear, a lot older than some of what I have heard here suggests. For crying out loud, the Anti-Slavery Convention was adopted in 1926. It is part of the body of norms. It's the oldest, and the ILO has been in existence since 1919. And maybe we need to actually ask ourselves, what do we see the human rights movement as? The second thing, if I may, is that the use of the word rights in itself offers a logic of claiming, not a corpus that we can amend and re-amend at the say-so of a self-constituting global parliament of do-gooders. This is a negotiated space, and everyone is welcome to it. And so it's up to people to frame their struggles howsoever they want. It is also up to the people who hold the money to put their money where they want to put their money. But money is only one asset, and it is by no means the only asset at the disposal of this conversation. There are lots of other people who bring lots of other things. And it seems to me we've got to find ways of valorizing all assets brought to the table. And I'll end on this note. When Kwame Nkrumah was fighting for the liberation of Ghana, he was up against several people who were much richer and much more well-heeled from the Ashanti kingdoms and had a lot of more property. And he was up against the Brits, and the Brits were using the methods of what today we would call authoritarianism. But the people of Ghana, of the people who were behind him, were ordinary people who were willing to put a dime and a shilling to his legal defense, and they ultimately won. None of those people got money from outside Ghana for that struggle. That was philanthropy. It was strategic philanthropy. Sometimes we've also got to have the humility to learn from the people whom we think don't bring much to the table. And that really is the point I want to emphasize. This relationship of North-South philanthropy, money, not on the other thing, is underpinned by a power dynamic. And maybe to end with this anecdote, I went to visit an organization in an African country late last year, and their biggest partner was a private philanthropy. And I asked my friends, and when I got in, they were actually, this organization was in a conversation, telephone conversation. The leader of this organization was in a telephone conversation with the local representative of this philanthropy. And when the tone of the conversation sounded somehow, so I asked the colleague in this organization, I said, when last did this foundation you're talking to come to visit you? And the colleague responded, no, they never come to our office. We always have to go to them. That, I suggest, is the problem. The idea that those who bring the money are the powerful people who we always have to go to and who will never come to us to learn anything is fundamentally at issue in this conversation. I'll rest and yield.
Thank you, Chidi. Coach, do you want to jump in on that?
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree. You know, saying again about this you know, the sharing of power and how we look at you know, who is giving and who isn't. Actually, what are we learning from this experience? What are we learning? I mean, if you look at the, you know, yesterday we talked about the growth in the last 30 years of the human rights movement and what we've learned through it. And, you know, I think it's sometimes really hard because you know, I think the movement has got a real kicking in the last kind of years, okay? And people have said, oh, well, it hasn't delivered this, it hasn't delivered that. But if you actually look at, you know, the human rights framework that was conceived after, you know, Bretton Woods and all that period, and you look at all the other things that were conceived, right? I mean, like, democracy, how's that doing, right? You know, communism, socialism, this idea of trickle-down, you know, economics, capitalism that doesn't, you know, regenerate itself. I mean, compared to those things, I think in the 21st century, the idea that, you know, the human rights, the idea that, you know, you should, what civilians should have and the rights that civilians should have morally is incredibly robust, right? And so it's just about how do we deliver that to people. And as you were saying in Ukraine, you know, I think governance is in real trouble right now. And I think one of the reasons that you know, a lot of light is being shone on us is because, you know, that framework has fallen, right? I mean, you know, I know what you were saying about you know, the Security Council, but, you know, if one of the P5 countries, I mean, out of this framework when human rights came out, right, it was balanced on the idea of that there would also be this thing called democracy, and that you would this fluffy thing on the side, and democracy would be in the middle, and then you have this Security Council that would provide justice, right? These 5 countries would provide justice. And where has that justice happened around the world? You know, and where have we seen it? And this isn't the only place, right? There has been other wars before, and you've seen at the UN when we tried to get the resolution previously against, you know, Russia, a lot of people stood in the middle and African countries who said, well, you know what? I see what's happening in Ukraine, but I was also there in Iraq, and I saw what happened there. How many people died? When did we all go to the UN and say, let's condemn America? Or, and you know, just as Russia have said, you know, these are, you know, they're fighting Nazism, we said we're going to find weapons of mass destruction, right? What happened? Were they there? No. Have any of us said that we're going to take anyone to the ICC? You know, and even that ICC idea, who had to sign up to it when it was constructed and who isn't signed up for it, right? There are all these power things, and everyone in this room knows all this stuff, so I'm just repeating stuff. But I think if there's anything that we've learned from this, it's that being on the other side of it, we see how enraged we are, and we see how unjust this all feels. And I think, you know, maybe one thing that might come out of this is this sense of, you know, just going into places without a real understanding of the ground, of the people, what's happening, what is your exit strategy, how do you support people? All these things might bring back a little bit of the aggression that we've seen. You know, I think we talked about it earlier about the wheat. You know, we're at the position where in the last 4 years, if you look, the price of arms has gone down consistently every single year. We have an abundance of arms around the world. The price of wheat and food is going up every single year. What are we doing, right? And so I think there's all these issues. I've kind of lost my track there. Yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. I think we have talked a bit about, on the one hand, I think the institutions that have been built by the global human rights movement, and then maybe the failure to use them and implement them in an impartial way, which was part of the vision, but has maybe not been part of the practice. And then does that taint the whole thing, or is it just something that can be adjusted and corrected? And then I think we've talked a lot about these street movements, Black Lives Matter or Me Too, and I think all around the world, you look in Afghanistan and Russia even today, you have these street people demonstrating, and it feels a bit new to me, maybe not, maybe it's just social media and media information flow, but maybe it is also a byproduct of the human rights movement's work over the last years, that it has gotten, and I think you said this yesterday in our discussions, that we've had some kind of saturation in people's minds about human rights that may not have been there before, and maybe that leads to this. But meanwhile, we have these movements that we're really maybe not that connected to in a formal way. So around the world, we have these kind of spontaneous outpourings like the Arab Spring or Russia or you know, Me Too, Black Lives Matter. And my question is, and I'll ask Atala to introduce himself and come in on this, how do you feel these mobilizations, and we did talk about this in the last panel a bit, how have they been connected to a human rights framework? Should they be connected to a human rights framework? And how would that look different in your view, Atala?
Thanks, Jessica. Thanks for having me on the panel. And it's a pity I'm not in person. I can realize lots of friends in the audience, dear friends, that I couldn't see in person. Before I answer your question, just briefly to talk about myself, my involvement in both philanthropy and human rights. Human rights, I'm an activist. Ever since I was a small kid, I'm born in Jerusalem in the 50s, and I was born as a refugee. Although my family didn't move very far, maybe 300 meters in 1948, but they became refugees. And I became a refugee with a birth certificate from UNRWA, which is the UN agency. And to me, there was always, I never knew where somebody asked me, how did I know about it? I never knew where I got it from, that I have same rights as everybody else in this world. I have the right to travel, I have the right to study, I have the right to seek opportunities. And this persistence came from that human rights perspective. Ever since I was a kid, you know, we studied philosophy in school, and it was always associated with that, and always at work. I had to make affidavits twice in my life to prove who I am, because my birth certificate doesn't come from a government. And you cannot imagine that I stand in an office and they want me to prove who I am. And I once quoted Descartes, I am here, so I am. You know, there's a house in Jerusalem where I grew up, there's a school, I have friends. What more do you want to prove who I am? It always worked eventually, but persistence, and that persistence came from, I would say, the human rights movement. Maybe not this movement you are talking about, but the human rights in its maybe Groen mentioned three words, freedom, dignity, welfare, question mark, but you know, it does represent that people have to have opportunities. So this is my link to the human right, and I was asked that question when I was a founder of the Arab Human Rights Fund, and somebody asked me, why? You are a civil engineer. You have involved in managing water sectors in NGOs. Why human rights? I told him, it's natural. Human rights is the umbrella of a dignified life, and it falls there no matter what we do. It belongs to that framework. Now, if the human rights movement doesn't see itself as the umbrella, it's the problem of the human rights movement rather than the concepts themselves. Over the last 30 years, I've been involved in building infrastructure and managing foundations, so more active on the philanthropy side. And I helped creating the Arab Foundation Forum, the network of Arab foundations, WINGS, which is the network, global network of networks of philanthropy. And of course, I'm on the board of the Arab Reform Initiative. So this is my relationship in philanthropy. To come to your question, absolutely. You know, when the Arab Spring happened, I went through lots of ups and downs. When I was a student in Lebanon in the early 70s, we thought we were changing the Arab world along social justice, along proper governance, prosperity for all. It failed. It failed again after the first Intifada in Palestine. You know, these dreams and ambitions. And then the Arab Spring came. And it shows that dreams will always remain there. We might go through ups and downs, but those dreams will always remain there. And within maybe hours, when in Tunis things happened, one could reflect on all the positive social change that one has been working for. And I think maybe human rights was not the heading. I'll speak about the Arab Spring, but Me Too, it falls in the same social movement in terms of trust. Uh, Human rights as such wasn't the term. People didn't have affinity to that term. So we shouldn't blame the term itself, but the content was on the ground. And people used social justice rather than human rights. But would I say, in my case, my civil and political rights are different than my economic, social, and other kind of rights that I have in my life? And Groin mentioned that they are all interlinked. This split is artificial, and it's the failure of the movement not to grasp this interrelationship, in my opinion. And there was lots of discussions in the Arab Human Rights Fund that we should not be restricted to that narrow definition. We should move where people are willing to move, where they feel there are spaces and they can create them to make change. And these changes are incremental. You never know when they will come, but when they come, we should be ready to grasp them. And the Arab Spring, I don't think it failed. It has ebbed, but I think the dreams are there. Sudan was sleeping, and then all of a sudden, when everybody went down, Sudan blew up. So the dream is always there, and I always see it as the human right concepts are driving. It's an umbrella. And to the first question that you asked, I'm always puzzled when we talk about the SDGs. Human rights are not featured there, although I've been arguing all along that human rights is the umbrella of these 17, and not only in number 17 where there are partnerships. So I would say definitely it's anchored in human rights, those movements. And the problem with what we know in terms of philanthropy and human rights, because both are suffering the same thing, by the way. When we were talking 10 years ago about global philanthropy, to me, it wasn't a US foundation giving grants in the Arab region. That's not global philanthropy. Global philanthropy is philanthropy in the US and philanthropy in the Arab region. And together with philanthropy in Africa, together with philanthropy in other regions, they form global philanthropy. They are not the same by any means. They are diverse. And do we suffer because they are diverse? Or we learn, as Shidi mentioned, we learn from each other and enrich the experiences, because each one of us is bringing something to the table. And here I just would like to make a footnote. I don't know whether she's in the audience, that in Wings, together with Dr. Barbara Leopold from the Center on Philanthropy and Civil Society, I think it is in SUNY, same university, we are doing studies, preparing studies by colleagues, members of Wings, on the cultures of giving. So we don't call it philanthropy, we call it cultures of giving, because at the end of the day, it's resources going to social good. And I agree with Shidi, money is not the only resource. There are other things, and that should be laid on the table. And maybe some foundations are rich in terms of money, but their partners are on the ground, are not recipients, they are partners, and they bring to the table frontline work. And believe me, human rights is a dangerous sector. We'll come back later if there is a chance. This is not a safe sector to work in. It's a dangerous one. And you might be safe in the US sitting in New York, but it's not the same in Cairo or in other places around the world. So one has to be aware of that. And the disruption is happening because people from around the world, through connectivity, they're asserting their voice. They are not dismissing what the Anglo-Saxon discourse is. They are just saying there are things that are different, not better necessarily, but there are things to be learned from and cross-learning. I stop here. I can go forever. But
Thank you, Atala. Grania, you want to weigh in?
Yeah, thanks, Jessica. Maybe just a quick aside first to Chidi. I enjoyed your comment about, when did human rights begin? This is a big debate amongst academics that doesn't happily trouble most of the acting population, but the idea of when did human rights begin, one of the very prominent recent critics of human rights says in the 1970s with Jimmy Carter, and then many others say the anti-slavery movement and much earlier, and there are many things around the world long before the UDHR that count as what we now consider to be human rights. Anyhow, Jessica asked about, these protest movements, social movements, and, one thing I'll just say is that I mentioned the book I recently written. I did a number of studies of various campaigns in different parts of the world that had achieved some success, and what came out from those, and this is only a certain number of studies, but still I think it was interesting, was that those human rights campaigns that are not supported by social movements are infinitely less likely to bring about significant change. They may win small victories, but they don't bring about change in a major sense or a major structural sense. And that movements that or campaigns, human rights campaigns supported by, or not even supported in some formal sense, but underpinned by social support and a social movement, were far more impactful. And I think it's a real, not a dilemma, it's a question. I have no idea how funders will go about this, but I think that the task of thinking about, as you were saying as well, how to support social movements is a really important one. And for social movements, not so much social movements as the layer of civil society, the advocates, the activists, the NGOs and so on, need to think really carefully about how they can work with, not co-opt, but to work with and support the social movements that really bring the energy and the mass and the democratic kind of dynamism to human rights campaigns. I also think the other interesting thing about a lot of the social movements, and it goes back to this issue of intersectionality and indivisibility, is those always sound like slightly pious pronouncements, of the lawyers and so on, or the UN people. They say, oh, human rights are indivisible, or the academics talk about intersectionality. But they really are the lived reality of the people who are claiming rights. They don't distinguish, as Atala was saying, between their rights to eat and to housing and to shelter and to food, or their rights to protest and to speak and to act and so on, or to vote. And similarly, anyone who works on gender, Mona talked about the pandemic, knows that these things are just fundamentally, inextricably interlinked in the experience of women. So to me, the fact that the Black Lives Matter movement identified itself, one of its co-founders said, this is a human rights movement early on, not a civil rights movement. You might think, what did she mean by that? Not a civil rights movement, meaning not the American idea of civil and political rights only, we don't talk about redistribution, but economic and social rights, civil and political rights, justice, so the Black Lives Matter movement was an intersectional, indivisible, all the cliches, movement par excellence. And they saw themselves, even though that doesn't come across, we don't tend to think most of the time about the racial justice movement in the US or elsewhere as a human rights movement, has got that label, but that doesn't matter in a way because it is understood in this broader sense and maybe deeper sense as a human rights movement by many of its protagonists. And I think the same is true of many others. The gender marches around the world, they're not, you know, they're not just about violence against women or reproductive rights. They're about economic empowerment. They're about parity. They're about equal dignity, all kinds of things. And I think, you know, social movements are important both because of the power and energy they bring to, you know, pushing for human rights advances, but also because they are the lived reality of people who feel the absence of rights, and they don't distinguish, you know, in these kind of formal ways between different types of rights. And I think that's something really important for funders to be thinking about. Maybe one more thing I could just say, that a few people have mentioned civic space as well and authoritarianism. And again, you know, we identify all these challenges separately because in some ways they are conceptually separate, right? But they're not in reality, again, either, because, you know, under authoritarianism, you know, all rights suffer, you know, so it's not just that, you know, it's a repression of civil liberties and so on. We might say, oh, well, you know, they do well on the socioeconomic front, but as you see in the extreme example with Russia, you know, everything, you know, an authoritarian system which is ultimately about retaining control doesn't listen to or value its citizens and their voices and their needs. So I think the idea of supporting civic space is so important, not just because it's a traditional area of, you know, expression and political freedom and so on, but because it's linked to everything else. And I think some of the work on digital civic space is really important as well for, you know, people within authoritarian systems to learn the ways to help them within these systems of control to be able to access networks and so on in the rest of the world. But I think some of the work being done, I think Wings and Civicus and some other organizations do important work in this. And again, I think it's really important remembering both sides of the digital issue, that it's a massive transformative social revolution at present, but it's, you know, a force for advancing, you know, evil, I would say, you know, repression, authoritarianism, surveillance, but also a force for progress. And the really important thing is to harness the ways in which it can be supported for progress.
It's a little ironic, I think, that you say Black Lives Matter use the term human rights to distinguish themselves from civil and political rights when we spent the last few days talking about the human rights movement as really focusing by and large on civil and political rights and not the full range of rights. But I think that, as you say, as you get closer to the ground and the lived reality of people, these distinctions feel artificial. And certainly in the women's movement, you just see it all the time. I mean, there's really very hard to distinguish, even at an academic level, I think, in some particular rights, what's economic versus what's political. You know, it just merges. So in a way, that brings us to the question of setting priorities and the role of funders in setting the priorities when we're looking at how we define human rights, or, you know, how close we get to the ground. And historically, as we've said, it has mostly been at a more global level than a local level, but it's certainly moving in that direction. So how does that affect the system of establishing priorities? And I'd love to hear from Atala and Chidi about this. You know, how are funders determining priorities? How is that system working from your perspective, and how could there be greater collaboration between international philanthropy and national philanthropy within a country beyond merely re-granting funds? As you mentioned, you know, there's so many other forms of value, but at the same time, I think Chidi mentioned this dynamic of you come to us, we don't come to you. You know, what are your thoughts about how those priorities are set and how that could be different? Atala, do you want to begin?
It's a very good question, because it has been, in my opinion, the dependency on foreign funding that we call in the Arab region removes the legitimacy of the work of human rights organizations. That's one of the reasons why the Arab Human Rights Fund, together with friends, we tried to create it to say that this is a local agenda, and it's not an agenda by foreigners. And foreigners are adding to our agenda rather than us doing theirs. for many reasons. The good thing about our sector all that when we fail, it's lessons learned. So there is nothing wasted. It's things learned. And today, the Arab Human Rights Fund has been closed because we thought that it's better to close it because we couldn't fundraise locally. We only managed to fundraise over a span of year and a half, which is 2012, 2013, and it shows when the Arab Spring was at a high point, it shook, it created less fear, if you want, in society, and especially people with money. Because remember, people with money are in many cases, they are in bed with regimes in power. That's how they make the money. So there is that dichotomy. Businesses might suffer if they go against the government, while there might be an urge for them to do systemic changes in society. And it happened in 2012, we saw it. So if it happened once, it might happen again. So as long as we're ready to capture the opportunity. So my message to players, foundations that have been traditionally supporting human rights is to be open-minded on entry points of action in various countries. So there has to be, the clue has to be taken from people on the ground. Second, that money is not the only factor. And I walked away from meetings when donors flagged that. I will not approach them because at the end of the day, we are not in the business of implementing programs. We are in the business of changing things. And if accepting money might create a question mark on credibility, you might as well not do anything because society would refuse it. And the third thing is really to not to dismiss the elements in civil society that are doing services like supporting children or women, because some of the impact of that work, if aggregated and curated by human rights organizations, might lead to systemic work at that higher level to change laws. And my experience, I work in Saudi Arabia, which is not easy to start with, and human rights is not easy to add to it. But women organizations managed to change through the parliament, the Shura, managed to push laws protecting divorced women. They managed to push laws protecting children. Now, this is not, to us, it might not be revolutionary, but it's radical and radical incremental change that creates platforms for other changes when the opportunity avails itself. So that incremental change has to be kept in mind rather than revolution. These are my advices actually on the financial side of things.
Just one quick follow-up, Atala, before we go to Chidi. I guess you're highlighting the challenges of accepting global funding, the questioning of credibility. And I guess the question would be for funders, is there a way for that to work differently so that you could get support from some of these funders without the problem of challenging your credibility? Is there some dynamic that could shift, or is it just built into the whole global geopolitical dynamics that it makes it difficult? Is it inherently kind of challenging, or is there some way that you could see it working differently?
If you focus only on the civil and political rights, it becomes very challenging because my advice is that locals have to be given their time to create enough support and enough infrastructure to move forward with this. But if you put in the mix the other kind of rights, which is the work of organizations that are working on social and economic justice, then these can be seen. And this is where, the maneuvering around laws, and I've seen it. There could be successful work happening and openings where money could be received, work could be done, and money raised locally. And from that work, uh, enough material will be pushed up into advocacy work for, that's where I use the word curating. So the human rights organizations will have that extra role of partnering one, working together and extracting all of those micro results from different parts of the countries, coming from the service, if you want, the philanthropy that going for services that will aggregate into advocacy level and push changes, like the example I quoted in Saudi Arabia, for example.
Thanks. Chidi.
No, thank you very much. Can I just continue from um, where Atalas touched? And in some ways, um, to begin by expressing pretty much complete agreement with the stream of consciousness that he's shared, and only merely illustrate perhaps with three other observations. First of all, it seems to me the biggest issues here, the biggest assets we're dealing with are intangibles. Obviously, you know, if you took an epistemic view of the matter, you could say that even money is an intangible. You know, it's an imagined asset. But really, the two biggest assets here are relational and legitimating. First of all, he makes the point with extraordinary authority about legitimacy and the fact that without legitimacy, you can't address the ultimate objective, which is change in a context of acute combat with power. So that the people doing this have got to have some legitimacy, and that space for negotiating their legitimacy and refining it and reestablishing it and sustaining it has got to be respected. The second thing is that requires a relationship of trust. That is not always the case in the relationships between folks on the front line, some folks who come with deep pockets, or people who think that they've got their hands in the pockets of people with deep pockets. Now, how that is negotiated, in my view, is rather important, and I can't say it enough. How I've seen, certainly in my time with foundations, how the people who think they work in foundations tend to treat the people who don't with utter disrespect. And that's putting it rather mildly. I feel much more strongly about this than my limitations of English language, because it's my third language actually, would allow me to express. But that really does undermine the efficacy of both the people on the front lines, but also the philanthropies in the things that they are trying to do, because it means you never really get to build up the kind of relational assets that will enable you to optimize the possibilities of your money. If you're punching at the weight of your money, you're not a philanthropy. And you know, the principle of leveraging allows you to do at least 400% of what of your asset value to begin with. And in my view, anyone who is not doubling the output of the principle of leveraging is not producing anything. That means that if you are a philanthropy and you bring $1 to the table, you've got to produce at least 8 times the value of that dollar. That, in my view, that requires that you build a relational asset base that is unexceptionable. It's got to drive so much of what you do that those relations then leveraging a lot more intangible assets that you could have. When you have people who are not able to do that, you then have problems. And that creates the basis, in my view, for the challenge with priorities. And the issue for priorities for me is that actually what we're dealing with are not priorities. It's about the cognitive capabilities of the people in foundations. So because they suffer cognitive limitations, that defines their priorities. The other thing is that they suffer convenience limitations. Okay, so we come to a situation, I would say we are reforming things, or we are reorganizing how a foundation works, because our convenience is we cannot administer. It takes the same amount of time or assets to administer grants of $5,000 as it takes to administer a grant of $500,000. And therefore, we will err on the side of giving $500,000 grants and abolish interest or investment in $5,000 grants, even though you actually may produce a lot more change with a $5,000 grant. I mean, listen to the story about the ticket, for instance, than you do with a $500,000 grant. And because local groups or frontline groups don't have absorptive capacity on a sustainable basis for a $500,000 grant at the point you want to make it, what this means in effect is that you're shifting assets to the global north to determine for the global south, based fundamentally on the consideration of assets, the consideration of convenience. And that convenience asset can itself also be a cognitive deficit because you don't recognize the other things that you could do or achieve as a result. So part of what I'm arguing here in this rather somewhat convoluted way is really a challenge for the philanthropists. How do they maintain a continuing knowledge stream and information stream that enables them to be up to date sufficiently to overcome these relational asset limitations, cognitive asset limitations, and convenience asset limitations? I'll stop there.
Thank you. That's a lot. I think brings me back to the phrase that Duncan used earlier, the tyranny of impact assessment. And when you get down to that level of $5,000, you just need to rethink everything. Is there more trust that has to come into it and maybe less risk associated with it? But it's a whole different universe from, I think, the way many of these large foundations have structured themselves. Let me just open it up for questions and comments from the floor. Katrina. Yes, let's start at the back.
Hi, Atta. Brad Smith here. Good to see you. It's been a long time. You know, both yesterday and today, there's been a lot of talk about authoritarianism, versus democracy, and civil and political rights, and then social, economic, and cultural rights. And on the panel just a few minutes ago, something was said about inequality and how dangerous inequality is in the world and how it needs to be addressed. And I was wondering if we're not falling into this trap of sort of, democracy good, authoritarianism bad, and overlooking the fact that, increasingly authoritarian governments are being democratically elected. They're illiberal democracies. And I know you're writing a book on illiberal human rights. And while I think all of us would agree that authoritarian governments don't do a very good job on civil and political rights, sometimes they do a not bad job on things like health, addressing poverty, other kinds of welfare. And, I wonder if there's a way we need to sort of rethink about this and make it not so binary, and how it is also related to the way we define human rights. Because I think if we say that, human rights are only civil and political rights, therefore, we really have sort of no way to explain democratic authoritarianism.
Any comments from our panelists? Lots of comments. Grania?
Sorry, yeah. I mean, the bottom line is I don't believe in illiberal democracies. I don't think, having an electoral system which amazingly, like in Hungary yesterday, produces this overwhelming majority. It's not a free and fair election. So, yeah, there are electoral authoritarians all over the world at the moment, but what we see is that they are elected the first time in an election, just as Trump was elected here, and he's an authoritarian in my view, but was elected. But authoritarians tend to then control the system to prevent opposition, to take control of the media and so on, and I think that's what has been happening in many of these authoritarian systems. But your basic question is, I realize, not just that, it's about, but don't authoritarian systems often do well on socioeconomic terms? And certainly, I think that's right. That's the point about China and Singapore and many other countries. and democracies have failed in many, not in many respects, but democracies are deficient when it comes to some democracies. Socioeconomic equality, maybe America is a particularly bad example. Some European social democracies do better to manage civil and political and economic and social rights. But on the two extremes, extreme authoritarian systems and democracies without a strong social welfare system, I think do badly in human rights terms. So that it's not that we want democracy of any kind and it's better than an authoritarian system of any kind, but I'm a really deep believer in the importance of human freedom and human choice about the kind of political system people live in. So I can't accept that, there's evidence that authoritarian systems do better. Actually, there isn't that clear. There's contested evidence about welfare and whether it does better under authoritarian systems or otherwise. But to me, the point is the indivisibility is to have both of these. And to me, inequality at the moment is as much a threat to human rights as authoritarianism is. But I think they're both really fundamental challenges for the human rights system to address.
Yeah, I would just sort of follow on from that. I think I sort of feel the same way. It's the idea of it's okay. Who is saying that? And I think that if you look at, for example, something like the Arab Spring that we kind of looked at when we were looking at Africa, there was this sense that actually the GDP of those countries was quite strong, that the economics were quite good. So why did that happen in Tunisia? Why did that happen? And it was this, there wasn't the balance, right? If you look at our data, you can see that you need this balance for humans to thrive. And if you don't have that, it leads to, it leads to insurrection. It leads to people being unhappy. That you can't just hold people down just because they're giving them money. I mean, we'll see what happens in China. We'll see what happens in other places. But you can see this push comes up. And a sort of a side attack, aside to that, when I was first, started working, there was lots of my friends in Africa from, right across the continent who all were just like, no, we're not interested in politics. We're not interested in politics. We just want to get a good job. We want to make some money, and if there's any philanthropy that's useful, it's let's get schools, help us to do the economic benefits, because that's really what matters. Economics is what's really going to change Africa, it's going to change our lives or whatever. And 201, nearly all of those people in the last couple of years have just gone, you know what, there's a glass ceiling. Actually, even though I've gone off and studied and done other things, I come back to my country, I can't get a job. Or because actually, unless you know the president, you can't, there is no meritocracy. There is no way that you can move. Or if you're a girl and you've studied somewhere and you come back, you can't be employed as a doctor because of whatever. And so all of those people are out on those streets. If you look at, the anti-SARS movement in Nigeria, for example, what was that? Was it a feminist movement? Everyone was out there. There were women out there. There were LGBT out there. There were so many people who were frustrated. And these are these sparks that we're seeing of people just going, we've had enough. And it's the same in Sudan. You have lots of young women out there just going, we're never going back. We want the things that we want and we want to change. And the rest of the system doesn't even know how to deal with it because they're going, how do you hold it? They want different things. And then, I think one of the things that I love about human rights is it's a living struggle, right? And it's about, it's in real time, and it's as the world is changing. I was saying that, we look at our data in Africa, for example, and, in the last 17 years, and we do these Africa Barometer, we go out and do these, citizen surveys, and you look, and education in many of those countries has gone up. Education provision, health provision, in all those places. You go and ask people and they go, we don't have enough good education. We don't have good enough health. Everyone's desires keep going up. The bar is rising and rising. And they want full human rights. They want their freedoms. And, as people have said here, Regan has said, how you say it in those different spaces is a cultural thing. But the ideas are universal. And the framework, I think, has been great to encompass the wideness of our aspiration. But within that, and what is real in time is very different. And people go to it. Like, in India, you have, like in Uttar Pradesh, for example, there is a terrible statistic. It's like almost 80 to 90% of women and girls who are sexually abused or raped, it's because they go outside because they don't have clear sanitation. You know, that happens when they go to the toilet, right? Now, if that happened here, it'd be it's incredible, right? So is sanitation a feminist issue? It is in those places. They all interact with each other, right? And so that's why it's so strong they have that whole balance of things. And I think we're going to see it move back and forth in different places. That in many places that, where I come from in Africa, where people thought, the economic was the most important, and now going right back to civil and political. And they will keep coming back and forth because they need it all, but at different times they see it. And we see it at different times as well.
But just to go back to the
Can I,
question.
can I just say something, Jessica, if it's possible,
Of
just
course.
very quickly? Because in some ways, Brad's question illustrates for me the problems with our framework. It's infinitely much easier to theorize authoritarianism than it is to live within it. I was born in internal displacement. I went to school under the military. I was detained by the military, exiled by the military. And I take it personal when people tell me about the benefits of authoritarianism. And this is probably the reaction you're going to get from a lot of people. Now, it's okay to stay in New York and tell someone living under an authoritarian rule that these are the benefits of authoritarian rule, because when you've been detained by an authoritarian, it's difficult living in detention in a cell and having someone in the comforts of New York explain to you the benefits of being in a cell under an authoritarian ruler. But that really is the point about this conversation about Northern philanthropy and local experience and local activism. And it's also difficult to explain to the survivors of Mao about the benefits of authoritarianism, not to talk about the people who died, of course. So I do think that there needs to be a bit of reschooling of our usages in the human rights world and in the human rights philanthropy world. And that really is the only thing I can bring to this conversation. We really do need to reschool ourselves. And, it's not much different from a guy going to give a woman who's been raped lessons about rape. Sometimes we just have to be careful about some of these things, knowing that it can actually be triggering, or at least being aware that it can be triggering. That's the only thing I want to add to this. I'm sorry if I extended the conversation beyond what it should.
It's very important, I think, to hear that perspective. Because I think from my perspective, coming from a democracy and listening to the point about this binariness, it's like there's good and there's bad, and we live in what's supposedly good, except it's not that good. And it hasn't really produced equality. And I think the theory of democracy really depends on a certain kind of accountability that comes through a voting process that just doesn't work, which is why a lot of people don't vote. There's a disaffection with the process that makes it very hard to hold our own government accountable. So to think of it as good, bad, and we're good when we see so much bad, both on the civil and political rights even, and the economic and social rights, I see that half of the question. So it may not be like good, bad, it may just be bad, bad, and different kinds of bad that we have to address, and maybe in different ways. I don't know if I don't want to speak for the question, but I don't know that the intent was to promote autocracy. I think the intent was to just really look at this binariness and to question, are we a little too self-righteous? Because we haven't really been able to use our supposedly better system to create the results that we say that we're able to create. That's how I understood it. But let me move to the next question. I don't want to take all of your time. Go ahead. And also, let me just urge you with your question, since we're at the end of our panel and the end of our conference, anything really concrete that you can throw out there of what you think we should be doing differently or what you think should be the next steps, that would be a helpful thing to hear. Go ahead.
Thanks, Jessica. Martin O'Brien from the Social Change Initiative. I suppose this question of priorities and responsiveness seems to me to be at the hub of some of the difficulties that we have, and following on from your question, and I was struck by Duncan's comment about being responsive shouldn't be at the expense of kind of long-term investment, and I agree with that, but on the other side of that, it seems to me that the discussions in the previous panel about power, about rising authoritarianism, power regroups when you make a gain, it does something different. And I think part of the challenge for philanthropy and for human rights organizations is to work out when to change tack and to work out when to respond. And I think we're not very good at that. And some of that, I think, is because our systems for scanning and for connecting and listening to people aren't actually that good. And I was struck by Atala's comments about, having to prove who he was, and the rising problem of statelessness, which it seems to me isn't actually on the agenda of either the human rights movement or philanthropy, but millions of people being deprived of their access to rights through denial, and that increasingly becoming a tool of authoritarian states. So at what point and how do we improve our abilities to see actually what's going on and to realize that something needs to be done over there? Mindful very much of Duncan's point not to throw out, and I think we're not very good at that, and I'm thinking that may be some of what Casito, the guy who chaired the previous panel from OSF, that's what I think is about political philanthropy. It's about reading what's going on, understanding where change is happening, how power works, and I think we all need to get a lot better at that.
Thanks. Yeah, Lakshmi, sorry. Since you haven't said a word.
Hi, I'm Laksh. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Yeah, my name's Lakshmi. I work with Jessica in Donor Direct Action, and my experience has been mostly in the grassroots women's movement in India and the US. So my question is to the philanthropists here, because I come from a women's fund. I just want to know what have been the kind of tools for transparency and accountability to grassroots women's organizations or grassroots organizations, because we all know that human rights happens in the front lines. So, and I'm really glad for Avid's work on, recognizing that only a fraction of this money is trickling down to women's groups, for instance. That's the perspective I know, so I'm going to talk about women's groups and the funding coming to us. But I want to understand, have there been tools where you felt the need to be accountable and transparent about the money in your institutions, so we are changing the power dynamic, basically?
I think that question goes beyond the women's movement. I think it's really a fundamental question that we've been hearing from our panelists. And it's nice to frame it, I think, in terms of transparency and accountability, because we haven't used that language as much. We've been talking about power dynamics, but the power dynamics, of course, totally relate to the ability to have some accountability. And so I would just love to hear from any of you, any thoughts you have about transparency and accountability. How can those mechanisms work when you're dealing with a power dynamic that's inherently unequal? Because there may be other values, but the bottom line, which I think we all know, is that foundations are giving money and organizations of human rights need money. And that's just, inherently, I think, a certain kind of dynamic. So how do you fit transparency and accountability into it? Any good examples, any thoughts? And I'll throw it out to the audience too, but if anyone on our panel wants to address that. Or not.
Jessica, I might have a comment.
Yeah. Please go ahead.
Yeah. With the anti-terrorist certifications and laws, this issue, is brought time and again. There are two elements to answer the question to this. One is, at least when I advise philanthropists, this is where I go. There are two elements. One is the financial, and that's mechanical. We know how to do it. Bookkeeping, banks, etc. And even if you want to do it wrong, the banks will block you. It's that draconian, I tell you. A few days ago, I wanted to make a transfer to Wings in my membership, and my bank in Jordan blocked it. because it's an NGO in Latin America. And, I told them, look, I pay with my credit card, forget it. And the credit card is on a German bank, it went smoothly. And that shows the inequity in that relationship altogether, where laws are practiced. The other side, so that's a straightforward. Now, if the other part, the other side of it is the programmatic one. And this is where we need to be imaginative, we need to be flexible, and trust has to be playing a part there. And make it light, for God's sake. Don't put too many benchmarks, and let people do what they think is right to do. Now, this is the two elements I would put, but if I understood correctly, that how we make sure that a large amount of the money coming from the donor ends up actually on the ground and is not spent through intermediaries, as the case might be with the example of the 5,000 as Shidi mentioned, and the 500 or 5 million, because lots of money is siphoned at the intermediary level and very little ends up down there. And there's no other way than just push back all the time and make donors more educated. Fortunately, many donors, at least the ones I deal with, like to deal directly with the recipients. And that's a big threat to NGOs, by the way, as their role as intermediary is being eaten up. There's lots of changes happening that if we are not aware of it, the whole NGO sector and philanthropy with it, the whole of our sector might be becoming marginal in our society. And look at what happened during COVID-19. We had very little effect on how things work, unfortunately. I tried so hard. I was completely, I couldn't help. It was so prohibitive. So this is my answer to this transparency and accountability. There's a mechanical part, easy to deal with, and imaginative part, we control it, and we should be very flexible.
Can I just reinforce that from the fact that I think we've all got to accept the principles, but how we work them out in different localities has got to respond to the realities of different people and different places. I was deeply involved in the work on Darfur, for instance, up to the point where we had to help our colleagues with whom we worked on Darfur advocacy in Sudan leave Sudan. And through different parts of that piece of work, we had to calibrate and recalibrate mechanisms of accountability, partly because there was hardly any way you were going to do that under Bashir at the time without getting the colleagues involved in threats to their lives and their families. Ultimately, of course, they had to be extracted out of the country, and that even involved a greater degree of subterfuge than you would normally find in this sector. And sometimes you have to collaborate with people whom you would not wish to collaborate with, but they're the only people who know how to extract people from those situations safely. And that's just the way it is. It depends on the situation you're dealing with. As the chairperson of Nigeria's National Human Rights Commission, I lived with police protection because I was dealing with death threats all the time. And I was also affiliated at the time with another institution that needed to know things, some of which I could not disclose, quite honestly. But for 10 years, I did not live inside a house in my country. I had to sleep in a different place pretty much every other day. I could not fully disclose everything. This is my own personal experience, because if I did, I could have frightened a lot of people. But I was committed not to go into exile. And that meant, because if you have the chairperson of the National Human Rights Commission going into exile, that on its own was problematic. Okay, so judgments had to be made on the go. And 7 years after I ceased to be chairperson of the National Human Rights Commission, I still needed armed protection, much of which I had to procure for myself because if I had to pass the full bill to the organization that employed me, the questions would have been asked as to how the hell these bills are coming up. So I think the fundamental thing here is about trust and about honest and fair dealing. A lot of people will not understand, and that is why I continue to talk about relational assets. If you don't have those, nothing works. No system you set up cannot be subverted. Every system you set up is capable of being subverted if you don't have the right relationships to make them work in these difficult situations.
Thank you. That's helpful. I mean, trust keeps coming up. I just want to comment trust and respect. And the good news is that's not that hard. It doesn't cost anything. Jonathan.
Jonathan Fanton. Really, in a way, bridging from trust and transparency. I'd be interested in hearing your thoughts on the role that, or the intersection between corruption and human rights. And also whether we think philanthropy has a role to play in combating corruption. And I know there are conversations going on about trying to build support for an international anti-corruption court, and which would obviously have to be done by a coalition of willing nations, similar to the Rome Convention, that conference that gave us the ICC. So I'd be interested in your thoughts on corruption and human rights, and also on whether an international anti-corruption court would be a good idea, and whether philanthropy ought to be helping.
Thoughts? Corruption? A court, another court that might.
Do you have a thought?
Chide, do you want to talk about that, or no? Okay.
I'd like to hear your view as well.
Okay. Well, I mean, I spend a lot of time in governance, so I think corruption is a huge issue, and it's a really hindering development in all sorts of ways, basically. But I think as everyone sort of knows, I think the hard thing is that how do you do it, because it's so endemic in so many places, and it's a change of mentality, right? And it's really embedded in so many different ways. I was in Nigeria, and there was this, there was a long time that they'd been trying to build a road from the airport into town, basically, in Lagos. And they've been, it took a whole bunch of time and talked to a lot of different people about how to refix this road. And in the end, they finally got the money together to build this road. And just as they was about to do it, they had these huge demonstrations, because all of these hawkers and all these people had said, no, you can't build the road. Like, our businesses survive on the fact that the road is full of potholes, nothing moves, and so that's how we sell, right? And so you have this thing that you have to change the whole system into that. But I think, places like Africa, there's this whole idea of, there is corruption, and so, but, it takes two to tango, right? And there is, for every, bad contract or, that has come through, there's another side to it. And I think that in some ways, with more transparency, we're seeing that it isn't just in developing worlds, right? The whole world has a system that has done that. I mean, we saw the Panama Papers that came out, and it's so interesting how much of law protects people from certain loopholes, so they can take money from certain places or not pay taxes, whereas other people can, and that is embedded in the system of inequality. And it adds, again, to this whole issue of the reasons why it's so hard to shift that power dynamic. And I would say, actually, as another thing, we're talking about authoritarianism. I think that there's also, we have to realize that the reason why there is this push of authoritarianism in the world is because of the strength of the human rights movement in the past 30 years, right? All of these governments have seen that by educating and making people aware of their rights and what they want and how to hold them back to it, the only way to hold that back, if you want to keep your power, is to be more authoritarian, right? So we are essentially in a battle that is very much existential, that has come because of the strength of human rights. So.
The International Anti-Corruption Court, is that a good idea?
I don't want to say too much about it because I don't know the full details of where it is at the moment. I've heard about it. I think it's great. it's just who's going to sign on. And everywhere you go, there are so many loopholes to everything that how are we really going to make it do? I know, the Magnitsky Act I've seen work really, really efficiently in many places. Going, actually, do we just target people? And then whereas the international community can't hold it to account, actually just local jurisdictions can do that work. And maybe that is a really good way. And if more and more countries hold on to that, that's a really good way to pick out certain people and do that. And as we're seeing, the work and sanctions that's happening now with Russia, if we can hold, it'll be really interesting to see. But also, how does that will be used in other places and against other countries? And, it was really interesting to see that, when Biden came in, there wasn't the ease of communication, perhaps, that had been with Saudi Arabia beforehand, and with certain other countries, and that really held back a lot of their foreign policy actions. Unfortunately, we're seeing that because of the issue of oil, we're seeing that they're starting to talk again, right? So are we just moving things to another place? Are things really changing?
Unfortunately, we're running out of time, so I want to squeeze two last questions in here, but if I could ask you each to just do like 30 seconds, and then I'm going to, because I promised we'd finish right at 1, and then our panelists just think about maybe 1 minute closing remarks maximum. So Vinny, go ahead.
If we're going to push for an anti-corruption court, are we going to look at the U.S.? I just read a book, Nazi Billionaires, that's being published this week. And at the end of the war, the U.S. courts, or jurists that were deciding on the Nazis, excused most of it because we had to save German industry. And I think of the banking problems 8, 10, 12 years ago, none of the banks were really held accountable. No chief banker went to jail. You couldn't let J.P. Morgan fail. You couldn't let Wells Fargo fail. But the bills were passed on to stockholders and to the public. So if we're going to do that, we need to look here first, maybe.
No, that's probably not going to happen, but can we?
So this is a comment in the spirit of relearning, and I really appreciated it, Chidi, what you said about undoing this paradigm in our language and our attitude. First, there are huge swaths of human rights movements that either can't access our funding or refuse to take funding because they do not want the ties that come with taking our money. And I think we need to respect that, name it. At AWID, we talked about autonomous resourcing, so the resources that movements bring in money, very real money, knowledge, time, etc. We exist only because they exist, and it's not the reverse. The other example that keeps coming to mind when you talked about the relational, cognitive, and convenience limitations is the Buen Vivir Fund, which is an impact investing fund housed at Thousand Currents. And they started with this advisory group of investors and partners. The partners were primarily indigenous-based organizations, and they came together, and from at the very beginning, one of the so-called partners disrupted it and said, we're investors too. We are not being invested in. We are investors. And you can read about the trajectory of that, but it took being in the same place, respecting one another deeply enough, and retooling language to get to that point. And the third framework that I would offer is a personal mission of mine to reframe how we think about accountability, that it's not this one big moment, it's not a legal framework. It is in the daily acts of who we think about and who is our audience and to whom we are answering. I was at UNIFEM and then UN Women when we were founding the Fund for Gender Equality. And I lived in absolute fear that we would fail feminist movements. Everything we did was with the specter and the real advice of feminist movements. And what I watched over time and what I have researched is that fear shifted into a fear of not reporting our results well enough. That fear shifted into not telling our executive board the right things, not measuring it. And that kind of accountability, that internal accountability, is something that I think we all needed to hold on to. Those small decisions, who can change your mind? Who is involved in the decision making before it's done? And who do you inform in the end? And what can happen after that?
Excellent, thank you. Grania, should we start with you?
Great, thanks very much. So I'm just going to make a couple of points in response to things that were said. I'm not saying I'm skeptical about new international institutions, but I think we have a lot of international institutions. And in terms of priorities, the ways of holding people to account, the setting up of, anti-corruption mechanisms, I would think that we might start locally and nationally and regionally rather than thinking of an international, or at least putting a lot of priority on setting up an international institution. And that's only in part because of the kinds of arguments that have already been made about our international criminal accountability system. No US war criminal has ever been or ever will be held to account before those. So there's something, that we should think twice about what the priority is when doing this. I'm not saying it's not ultimately good. I'm a very strong believer in external forums for accountability that are not just domestic or national, but my broader point, I guess, I want to make before we close is that I do think the emphasis that some people have put on grassroots, listening to those who know what it's like, who know what they're claiming and why, and who have a sense of how to go about what they're doing, is really important. So that one issue about grassroots. But the other, maybe this comes back to the question that was a very difficult question by Martin, I think it is, about how do we know when we're funding the right thing and when to change and so on. My sense is that if you're going to support social movements, you're onto a good thing. And that I would echo what Duncan said about not worrying too much about impact assessment, because somebody mentioned Occupy and Atala has a few times mentioned the Arab Spring. Those are conventionally treated as failed movements. But they're not failed movements. They've been incredibly important in changing the discourse, in changing things fundamentally. The idea of the 1% and inequality, what Occupy launched, and the Arab Spring, to really fundamental entrenched changes, long term, very long term. And so I would just say that, I would just echo, Duncan's cautionary note about looking for impact. Obviously, you don't want to throw good money after bad, but in terms of grassroots funding and funding social movements, I think, the trust there is very important, and time, and just waiting, and to just trust that there will be, because this is what you should be funding.
Thanks. Okay, let's go to the screen so we don't get accused of in-person hierarchy. Atala.
The comment I would like to make is that human rights philanthropy, or human rights movement and philanthropy, or the three together in their own silos, they might have done good work in the past, and to assume if they continue doing the same thing, it will be good in the future, is a misconception. We always advocate, if you do today what you have done yesterday successfully, it doesn't mean it's going to be successful. There is a very quick changing landscape. Some people called it drivers of change or ecosystem. It's really moving. In the philanthropy sector, the relationship between profit and not for profit. There are lots of profit entities that are doing social good. Where do we place all of those? There is so much movement in that landscape that if we feel comfortable in what we have done in the past and assume we'll be successful, comfortable people do nothing or do very little, and we will be marginal. And my message is, look at what is changing, adapt, change, learn, and the cycle we tell people we work with. This is the cycle, the project cycle. You never stagnate where you are, and you keep learning and moving forward. Thanks.
Thank you, Atala. Chidi.
Uh, Thanks a lot. I think it's fair to say this is a collective learning for everyone, and we'll continue to do so. Look, the anarchists killed President McKinley and changed refugee law forever in many ways. After that phase, just shortly after that happened, Roger Casement produced perhaps the most far-reaching human rights report ever written in 1904 on the Congo. Gronier and Irish may remember Roger Casement. But most people don't count Roger Casement's report as a human rights report. And yet, that was the pioneering and defining human rights report, in my view. Now, what's my point? The human rights enterprise will adapt over the years and with every age to its challenges. And philanthropies have got to be alive to those adaptations, to shape them, to follow them, to make the utmost use of them for the attainment of their purposes, recognizing, in my view, that this is variable geometry. You're going to, at times, we may not always agree between the philanthropies on the front lines. And where we agree, we'll make common cause. Where we differ, we can mutually respect one another. That really is the fundamental point I wish to make. And in ending, to say on the point of anti-corruption court that President Fanton talks about, um, there is also a point of view that corruption is really about accountability and impunity. And if that is so, I tend to subscribe to the view that you can start at the national level and that an international institution may well be counterproductive and may not really have oxygen at this time. Thank you very much, and thanks for having me.
Thank you, Chidi. Hosh.
Oh, okay. So just to finish, I think I'm just going to say the points that we've said before. I think really, it's about listening, and follow the energy. I think that's kind of my sort of mantra. That where is in the activists on the ground, where even in your regions, or whatever, where is the energy? Who are the people that are making the moves? Which parts of the community are causing trouble? And see how you can support them and follow them, I think is really important. And also, we talked about priorities. I think they come from those people. They will look and say, these are the parts of the human rights agenda that we think we can touch first, that we can see how we can get that first, and to work with that. And the last thing is, I suppose, because we're on the last panel, I want to say something positive and blue sky green thinking, I guess. I just think the green revolution, as particularly somewhere like Africa, that's a huge chance for human rights, basically. We're in a continent where our population is doubling within the next 25 years. We're going to have 1.5 billion people in Africa by 2050, right? That is a huge amount of jobs. That's a huge amount of opportunities. We have 16 million people that come out of school every single year that are looking for jobs. There's risks with that, but also there's a huge chance we talked a little bit about different kinds of philanthropy and corporate philanthropy. Instead of being add-ons, what are the upfront costs of that? Do you say when you're building something, you have to think about energy provision, you have to think about schools, irrigation. How do we make that revolution and the power shifts that we hope will happen really useful for human rights and to do things that we want to change in the world? Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I think we've given ourselves a lot to think about, and it's just the beginning of a conversation. So I appreciate all of your participation here and online. The links will be put online so we can continue and bring in more people to the conversation. And I just want to end by thanking Jonathan Fanton and our whole team, especially Katrina Avila, who worked so hard to put this conference together, and look forward to continuing the discussion over lunch upstairs. Thank you.